Hi, and welcome in this new regional deep dive to discover one of the most mature markets regarding fleet and mobility management, Europe. In 20 minutes, Sjoerd Brenters, Director International Consultancy Services at LeasePlan, will unravel all the details about the European fleet market with attention to fleet electrification and with concrete tips to centralize fleet management in Europe in a global fleet approach. Enjoyed the presentation.
Welcome everybody to Global Fleet Conference 2021. My name is Sjoerd Brenters. I'm the head of the international consultancy team of LeasePlan. For the next approximately 15 minutes, I want to talk to you about the European continent, fleet management market, OEM landscape, a little bit about LeasePlan to start with, and I will end off with some outlook on 2021. So let's get started right away. A couple of words about LeasePlan. We are one of the largest leasing suppliers in the world. We manage 1.9 million vehicles in over 30 countries. We operate the entire value chain, which means as much as we can purchase and finance the vehicle for you. We will also resell the vehicle at the end of the contract, and we manage anything in between. Our fleet is built up of 76% passenger vehicles and 23% LCV vehicles. It's also a very diversified fleet in terms of brands, 11% Volkswagen, 11% Ford, 9% Mercedes, etc. Obviously, we are independent, so we carry all of these brands. Before I continue, I want to talk to you about Europe for a minute. You might be located outside of Europe and not too familiar with the continent, so I thought I would spend a couple of minutes on Europe and the continent itself. So let's first differentiate between Europe and the EU. So the EU is pictured on the right. It consists of 27 countries, while the total of Europe consists of around 50 countries. In the EU, 24 different languages are spoken, and actually 3 different alphabets are even present. So that tells you a little bit about the complexity already. In terms of country sizes, Germany is the largest country with 82 million inhabitants, and Malta has 400,000. That's the smallest country. So each country has its own taxation schemes, not only for income tax, but also for obviously vehicle taxation. I've pictured the Fleet Europe taxation guide here to emphasize this is a over 300 page document which explains all different taxation across the countries. So registration taxes, ownership taxes, also VAT. The fact that it's such a complicated and long or big document shows you a little bit about how complex this can be. Moving forward, let's talk about the fleet and OEM landscape, starting off with the fleet landscape. So what you see on the right, to start with that picture, is that the top 5 fleet management companies make up over 50% of the European fleet market. So it's LeasePlan, but also ALD and Arval, the top 3, and together with Athlon and Alphabet, the top 5 make up over 50% of the entire fleet. You'll see more names on there, random names, but it shows you that it's a more dispersed network of fleet suppliers than just the top 5, obviously. If you move to the left of the slide, we'll also see that if you look at total car registrations worldwide, China actually leads the way. And Europe is about at the same level as the US, with about 20% of global car registration. At the same time, if you look at number of fleet registrations, Europe leads the way with around 33% of registrations. So this goes to show, in relative terms, Europe is an important and large market in terms of fleet management. When we look at the OEM landscape, there's about almost 300 vehicle assembly and engine plants in Europe, almost 200 within the EU. The graph on the right shows what vehicles actually are produced, how many or what share are produced by those OEMs. This is production numbers from January to December of 2020. Volkswagen Group accounts for 25%. PSA Group in second place, 14%. If we add FCA Group with 5.9%, that's a large 20% for the new Stellantis merger in second place. And then Renault in third place with 10%. So if we add all that up, the top 3 OEMs account for almost or over 50% of new car registration in Europe. Some of the items on the left that we're looking at, OEM consolidation is what OEMs are very busy with, increased platform sharing, simplified configuration, and standardization of engines. So, for example, or as I already mentioned, the FCA and PSA Stellantis merger, these two companies together account for 22% of EU market share. If you remember, VAG 25%, so the top two already account for almost 50% of total market share. Increased platform sharing that I mentioned, so between OEMs, but also within OEMs, of course. Volkswagen and the famous MQB platform. The platform is used for the Volkswagen Golf, also for the Audi A3, etc. Just to standardize and simplify things more and more, and obviously to keep costs down. Top right, another thing we're seeing is a reduced model portfolio. So some of these models that you see here are no longer produced or are not going to be produced any longer in the future. Most recent example that I've heard of, Ford Mondeo, will be out of production somewhere next year. What are OEMs also facing is stricter CO2 focus from a government perspective. So they're involved in CO2 pooling. That's actually something that's allowed by government. What that means is that the emission levels from two OEMs can actually be pooled together in order for them to reach their targets and not to pay high fines. And finally on this slide, rationalization. So we'll see more simplified number of trim levels in case of the Polestar 2, for example. Discontinuing of manual transmission for the Daimler Mercedes group. And potential discontinuation of small diesels for the Renaults and Seat. All things OEMs are involved in to simplify things, to keep costs down and to create economies of scale. Now, McKinsey has focused on, has done a study, mobility post-COVID, which I want to touch upon for a minute. So what we're seeing there is that mobility usage patterns for top 5 EU countries, pre-COVID and post-COVID. So what we're looking at here is the number of Apple routing requests by transport mode for those EU 5 countries. So we're looking at driving, transit, and micro-mobility. So starting off January 2020 at index 100, we'll see that obviously once COVID hits, we'll see a big decrease in the number of Apple routing requests. It does pick up, and actually the number of routing requests for around driving are back at the 100 index level around summer, which is not true for transit and micromobility. So we really see a decreased interest in, for example, public transportation. That's still true. This interest is still a little bit lower, although at the end of last year, we do see a decrease for all modes of transport. People were simply traveling less. Second slide here, change of transportation modes after returning to the next normal versus before. Now, one thing that stands out is the increased interest in walking or biking with a private bike. There's a large expected increase there. The other modes of transport, not so much, no huge significant changes, some exceptions here and there, but especially interesting is the increased interest in walking or biking. And finally, from the McKinsey studies, cities accelerating transportation transformation. So we're seeing more and more cities announcing access restrictions, conversion of carriageways to cycle paths in Brussels. The Santa Monica Pier in LA actually is a zero emission zone right now for commercial vehicles. More and more focus on low emission zones and access restrictions. My personal belief is that this is not going to be a big bang, not something you need to be worried about tomorrow, but I would keep an eye out for those changes, especially when you need city access to run your business, for example. Moving on, European registrations and EV readiness. So the number of vehicle registrations Q1 2021. So if you move to the far right of this slide, first thing we'll notice is that in orange, 2021 March numbers, actually much higher than 2020 March numbers. So that is a positive sign. Things are picking up. But if you look at overall registration, 62% plus versus March 2020, that's a big plus. On the downside, it's still 22% lower than March 19. That was before COVID. Overall, we did start the year quite okay, plus 0.9% registration versus year-to-date of last year. We're talking about Europe mainly here, but just to touch upon China, US, Japan, we also see pluses. For China, US, the pluses are much bigger than for Japan, but nevertheless, they're all looking positive. Looking at new car registrations, if we zoom in on fuel type, we see 2019 versus 2020, see a big shift. So looking at hybrid electric vehicles, battery electric vehicles, plug-in hybrid electric vehicles, they accounted for about 10% of new passenger car sales in 2019. We moved to 2020, the same fuel type vehicles actually account for over 25%. That's a big change within 1 year. This shift in the decrease from petrol and diesel, we'll continue to see that. This is just 1 year we're looking at, but before 2019, these numbers were for petrol and diesel much higher even. We can expect this to go down. The EV Readiness Index, something that LeasePlan does on an annual basis for 22 European countries. It focuses on the electric vehicle transition. Part of that is how it's built up. It consists of the EV market in general, EV infrastructure, and TCO. And those three main items consist of sub-items in turn. For example, number of charging stations, available EV incentives, etc., etc. Results for 2021 on the right. Number 1 EV readiness country, Norway. Number 2, Netherlands. Number 3, UK. You'll see, of course, from green to red, some of the countries where you may not want to focus on initially in your EV transition. What we're seeing is this EV uptake is really largely driven, very much pushed also by the availability of incentives. We'll see 2 examples here. United Kingdom, strong increase, plus 126% increase in registrations due to the available government incentives and a low driver taxation. Same thing in Germany, plus 200% compared to last year. Those incentives really push EV uptake. At the same time, there's a push towards OEMs from a government perspective to also reduce CO2. That works 2 ways. There's very clear EU regulation setting targets for OEMs to reduce CO2 emission levels, and the super credit system versus the excess emission premiums define where a OEM is actually positioned. That means super credit system, every EV put on the road for last year, 2020, actually accounted for 2 vehicles, which you could then obviously count at 0 grams of CO2. And at the same time, the other way around, if you exceed the average, you actually pay 95 euros per gram that you exceed. So there's a strong push from EU towards OEMs to reduce CO2. Looking forward, some general trends for 2021, new car registration. So fuel type, we looked at that. The shift towards EV and away from diesel will continue. Something that will happen. We saw a share of 10% for electric and hybrid vehicles in 2019 to 25% in 2020. That shift will continue. CO2 emissions will also continue to decrease from passenger cars in the EU. It will happen because of the shift to EV, maybe the uptake of hybrid technology. Also, I still expect that petrol and diesel vehicles will also still improve in terms of CO2 emissions. And finally, if you look at vehicle segments, something that I wanted to touch upon as well, the number is relatively high. That's why I wanted to point it out. 38% of new passenger car sales in the EU in 2019 actually were SUVs. So that's a pretty big market share there. In the past, I know that a lot of car policies did not allow for SUVs, mainly because of the correlated high CO2 emissions because of the vehicle being heavier and using more fuel, which is not valid, of course, if the SUV is an EV, then the emissions are 0 anyway. So that can no longer be a reason to exclude SUVs from your car policies. And as you can see by that 38%, uptake is very strong. What else can you expect in 2021? So from 2019 EV scarcity to 2021 abundance, you see some of the usual suspects here from an OEM perspective. and their upcoming models, some of which we've already seen on the road. Volkswagen ID.4, for example, some of which are still about to arrive. Much more to come, from common fleet vehicles, maybe like Volkswagen ID.4 to the Dacia Spring, a little bit of a smaller model, smaller battery, nevertheless very interesting to monitor. In 2021, what can you expect? I think very interestingly, ultra fast charging. So the Hyundai Ioniq 5, 10% to 80% charge in 18 minutes. Many other models will also have similar kind of capabilities where you can add 100 kilometers of range in a matter of 5 minutes. The range anxiety should definitely decrease because of that. Vehicle to load technology. So you can obviously charge a vehicle, but you can also use the vehicle as a battery to charge other appliances. That's something also to keep an eye on. Very interesting technology. Increasing ranges, so WLTP range between 400 and 500 kilometers. That will no longer be an exception. Price towards parity and beyond. So because of those government incentives that I mentioned, but not only, but it will really help push EVs becoming more price competitive, more and more. And they are already price competitive in many countries and in many vehicle segments. Finally, what can you expect? Increasing number of charging stations. So in 2020, last year alone, there was a 43% increase in public charging stations across Europe. So there are already 260,000 public charging stations available, and the number will only increase. So what else for 2021? Made in China, ready for Europe. Maybe you were not aware, the number was also surprisingly high to me, but last year 1.3 million EVs were built and sold in China. The number will be growing to 1.8 million next year. So what's the change here? That China is now expanding also to Europe. These vehicles will need to be compliant, of course, for EU regulation, but they are coming. Very interesting. We haven't seen a lot of these on the road yet. MG has gained some ground in Europe, obviously, but the highways, the Series 3, these are all still to come. There's more to come. Very interesting to keep an eye out for. So to wrap this up, how to centralize fleet management in Europe in a global approach. So some of the basics that I touched upon. Europe, it's a very well-developed region when it comes to fleet and fleet management. The lease car, the benefit car is well accepted in Europe. Maybe if you're from another continent or not so familiar with the European region, many companies will provide a car benefit in Europe. Benefit car is well accepted. I touched upon the fact that top 5 lease providers cover around 50% of total European fleet market, and there are many more providers available in the region. And finally, the top 3 OEMs, VJ, Stellantis, and Renault, they share over 50% of new car registration. So to summarize, you don't need to reinvent the wheel when it comes to Europe. There is providers available, there's OEMs available, there is room for consolidation. You don't need to reinvent the wheel. The final slide here, how to centralize fleet management in Europe in a global approach. Some more specific points. Number 1, although there is one Europe, vast differences exist between countries. I started off with the difference in taxation and languages, obviously. So many differences there. Keep that into account. Number 2, allow for local adaptation when it comes to, for example, selection of vehicle brands. Maybe in Germany they have a preference for the German brand still, and in France a preference for the French brands. That's local preference. I know from experience from other projects that, for example, Skoda in Czech Republic often does well from a TCO perspective still. So there's some local adaptation that you might still want to consider. The optimum contract duration. I didn't mention that before, but it makes sense to look at different vehicle segments, different countries. It might make sense to apply different contract duration to optimize your cost, obviously. And finally, also allow some adaptation when it comes to the introduction of EVs. We've seen from the EV Readiness Index, some countries are green, some countries are very red, and you don't want to start in the countries that are red. They're probably too expensive. From a practical perspective, doesn't make sense. So take a gradual approach there. Number 3, from the McKinsey study, we also saw that we can expect some mobility usage shifting, different modes of transport, especially after COVID. Let's see how that picks up. and what is actually changing there. And finally, if you think about Europe and you looking at fleet, get ready for EVs. So there's an increasing number of low emission zones coming. Nothing to worry about yet, like I said, but it will continue to increase that number. There is a strong focus from the European Union on CO2 reduction towards OEM, so they will keep pushing also for EVs. That's also in their interest to sell EVs. Also, there's a growing number available from an OEM perspective. We've seen that from the incumbent OEMs, but also from the newcomers from China. Very interesting development, I think, for 2021. And finally, price parity. We all know price is very important in fleet management. Many EVs already show price parity or even better pricing than the regular diesel or petrol model. These are some of the key takeaways I would like to communicate to you guys. So thank you all for joining. I hope you found this interesting. Feel free to reach out to me or any of the global fleet contacts. And I wish you a very good day. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sjoerd Brenters from LeasePlan, for your expertise. Ladies and gentlemen, don't hesitate to watch the other regional and country deep dives available for you in this section.